Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's talk, which I've just been informed will last about an hour. It's my very pleasant duty to introduce to you this afternoon's speakers. Andrew Greaves, many of you will already know, and his brother Robert. Both from a distinguished family of Quakers. Thus I can describe them as Quakers with a pedigree. And of course, a pedigree that includes the subject really of today's talk. Their grandfather, Corder Catchpool. But in conversations I've learned that both their grandfather, Corder Catchpool, and their father both came to a position of objection to militarism and military service on grounds of conscience. But they arrived at this point by different paths. And that's an intriguing matter that I'm really looking forward to hearing. So, in a moment, I will pass you over to Andrew and Robert. But I think it's appropriate if we just give them a moment of quiet, and then, when they're ready, Andrew will begin to talk to us.
My father, whose story, of course, I grew up with, so I know it more closely, was born in 1883, actually, and had trained as an engineer, largely because he couldn't get into medical school because it cost too much money. At the time, you had to find your own money for that. And after he trained as an engineer, he felt called, actually. He also came from a great family. Actually, he was born in Leicester. He was born here in what at the time was Saxe-Coburg Street, which was now Saxby Street. He has been really interesting, but he never talked much about it. Yes, I'm not quite sure how old he was when he left, because at the time, while he was still alive, he had no particular interest in Leicester. But he did mention old John, so he obviously enjoyed climbing old John long ago. Today at the ceremony in London, we were hardly allowed to say anything because there were 66 of us who were relatives of conscientious objectors in the First World War. And this little booklet has a picture of every single one of those. And apparently there were 20,000 conscientious objectors in the First World War, which is a pretty large number. And I think Talk today on Radio 4 this morning was also on conscientious objectors. When the First World War broke out, my father was on holiday in Switzerland because he had a sort of health breakdown. He felt called to become a doctor, although he trained as an engineer by then and actually worked fearfully hard because you trained as well as working at the same time. So to get his degree, he was also training himself working. But he felt called to become a doctor and did get a small legacy from an aunt, so he had an opportunity actually to become a doctor. But for his entrance exams, he had sort of a sudden mind blank. It must have been a boring experience, and his family were extremely concerned. And he went off to Switzerland to recuperate and to climb the mountains, which became his great love and hobby the rest of his life, actually. Every year he would try and climb in the Alps, and it was in 1952 climbing the highest mountain in Switzerland, Monte Rosa, that he lost his life. he shouldn't have been climbing. He already had respiratory problems, but he was absolutely determined to climb that mountain because he had failed to climb it on 2 other occasions. One, because of bad weather, which fair enough that can happen in the mountains. He hung about in the mountain hut for a week. The second time was Mussolini and closing the borders, and they couldn't climb down into Italy. So he was frustrated a second time. So in 1952 he seized the opportunity of climbing with my mother the highest mountain in Switzerland, and survived that experience.
What was his name? His name?
My father's name, Corder Catchpool.
Well, I'm very grateful to Annette for being warm-up act and for covering the first part of Corder's life in an economical way so that we can move swiftly on to the outbreak of war in the First World War. But I hope it's clear from the clip that we've started with that by the time war broke out in 1914, Corder had already experienced a considerable number of highs and lows in his life. And there's one other to mention, which is that in 1904, when Corder was 21, a tragic blow fell upon the Catchpool family. 2 of his brothers, Hugh and Frank, aged 19 and 17, were on holiday near Lurgan in Northern Ireland with some local friends, and the boat that they were sailing in on Loch Neath was swamped in a squall, and several of the party were drowned, including two of Corder's brothers. Indomitable Friend, the biography of my grandfather by William Hughes, mentions that family tragedy helped to deepen Corder's dedication to a life of love and service. His youngest brother Jack, who was then at Sidcutt, a Quaker school in the West Country, later recalled that Corder used to write to me once a week in the difficult time following the loss of Hugh and Frank. Their death coloured his life with special sympathy for those whose hearts are filled with sorrow. At the outbreak of war in 1914, Corder and his youngest brother Guy had been on a hiking and mountaineering expedition, a holiday in the Alps, and when war broke out they were stranded there, and it took them several weeks to get back across Europe as it trembled on the verge of the apocalypse that was about to engulf Europe. By could we have the second slide for that? Thank you. Corder, yes. By 7th of September 1914, Corder was at Jordan's in Buckinghamshire, training as a volunteer in the 1st Anglo-Belgian Field Ambulance, later to become known as the FAU, the Friends Ambulance Unit. After nearly losing an arm during the training due to blood poisoning, Corder finished up with a fortnight's practice dressing wounds among the outpatients of the London hospital. And then, in the first week of November, he put on the uniform of the FAU and marched with his comrades through the streets of London to Charing Cross, chanting the inevitable Tipperary, bound for France. Within an hour or two of embarking, they were already in the thick of things. In mid-channel, an assembly of destroyers was clustered around the sinking cruiser Hermes, torpedoed aft. Corder wrote in his diary, later published under the title On Two Fronts, the following, and Rob will read it for you.
Before I start, can I just say that some of the things I have to read I find very moving, so I've got some tissues there. I'm hoping I'll if I do start to get a bit tearful, you just have to bear with me. So, yes, so he's on the in the channel. The sudden sighting of Periscope shook us into action. The units paraded on deck. We were out as a man, though the line was wobbly with seasickness. We were allotted a boat, a big honour and the first job for the unit. We picked up a score or so of bobbing heads and got them aboard the Invicta on stretchers lowered from the decks by ropes. I got my hand crushed rather badly, didn't notice the pain until I was endeavouring to grip a drowned sailor's slimy tongue. The rescued were taken back to Dover, and the transports turned again and continued to Dunkirk. As soon as we got alongside, they asked for immediate volunteer dressers. Hundreds of wounded at the station and no one to attend to them. I am not rated as a dresser, but was mad to go, and went. Got round the doctor somehow. I believe I was almost irresistible just then. I shall never in my life forget the sight and sounds that met us. Figure 2 huge goods sheds, semi-dark, every inch of floor space, including the tracks and platforms, covered with the flimsy French stretchers, and on each stretcher a wounded man, desperately wounded, nearly every one. The air heavy with the stench of putrid flesh and thick with groans and cries. 400 wounded and 1 French medical student to attend to them, and 2 English officers helping voluntarily. Half dead as we were with fatigue, we flung ourselves into this work throughout the night. The need was so great. Consider this man, both thighs broken, and he has travelled 20 kilometres sitting on the seat of a crowded railway carriage, or the one with his arm hanging by a shred of biceps, or this with bits of bone floating in a pool of pus that fills up a great hole in his flesh, laughing bitterly as I turn away to vomit, overcome by the stench. He may well laugh bitterly, as he has lain 8 days on the filthy floor in an outhouse of some farm near the front. We are only able to touch a fringe. The priests touch more than us, hurrying through the solemn rite. Men are dying on all sides. At dawn, we began loading the hospital ships. We worked most of the day loading, for when the sheds had emptied, trains began to run through the quay, cattle wagons and box vans, filthy dirty, 12 stretchers apiece, packed like tinned fish. At 7 p.m, we paraded on the quay and marched to Saint-Malo, where quarters had been got for us. All dog-tired, you may guess, but after a meal I employed the OC to let some of us go down to the sheds again for the night. The thought of that groaning sea of tortured men was almost more than I could stand. The OC was adamant. We must take rest. Perhaps he was right. He had responsibility. I thought him heartless.
For the FAU's first week in France, the work was mainly as dressers in the shambles, as they named the huge goods sheds that filled anew with suffering every 24 hours, then emptied again for the next convoy. The unit established a base hospital at Dunkirk and began to string out dressing stations at Ypres and along the front where the Battle of the Dunes was being waged. Corder's work varied between trips in the mud and among the falling shells to collect French wounded at the front and service in the hospital. Corder found tremendous satisfaction in being able to give himself as completely as this in his work. Periods of service at the front alternated with weeks in the Dunkirk hospital, and gradually the first wild disorder and improvisation gave place to regulated hours of duties. At Christmas, he wrote,
I wish you could see our contingent of 90 men and 10 cars here tonight. All the glamour, if ever there was any, all the romance, if war has romance, almost all the interest has worn off long ago. We are just grimly working out a purpose, wading about in thick mud and through incessant rain from 6 a.m. until late at night. night. Sometimes the uncertainty of war keeps us out all night. It is mercilessly cold. I have not had my clothes off for a fortnight. The soldiers march forever backwards and forwards. Unkempt, bedraggled, the troops move to and fro from the trenches, passing in silence, without the shout of cheer. And here and there, with a snatched embrace, a sob, and a whispered, "If I'm lucky enough to come back."
At this time, Corder also made his first contact with Germans. Corder was fond of repeating the following anecdote. I was delighted the other day to see how very kindly one of the nurses was treating a wounded German, and I asked if she liked treating them. The reply should be shouted over Europe. It will certainly remain forever with fragrance in my mind. The pretty French shrug and "Il est blessé, que voulez-vous?" Our common humanity steps in and bursts the limits of nationality and the barriers of diplomacy. With his gift for simple friendliness, Corder was always striking up close personal acquaintance with the local inhabitants, who still hid in the shelled villages, with doctors, nurses, nuns, priests and pastors, as well as with the Tommies and the French poilus and their officers.
Do you know, until the present war, I could hardly think of the soldier as a human being. They were something so apart from me that I could not even bring myself to cry "good luck" to those lads going off in August, though perhaps that was something to do with the lump in my throat. Anyway, I'm certainly a saner man today than I was before I had to do with soldiers. They are just dear human souls, pretty simple mostly, lovable, and the very salt of the earth for kindness. I haven't seen them at bayonet charge. I may do yet, but of this I'm certain, that the souls lag behind those charging bodies, and when they come back bleeding, and it's all over, that frenzy, they're so still and gentle and loving again. It is grand the way the men give all, their comfort, their lives, gladly to serve their country in a cause they believe to be right. But when I look out of my window at night, as I do now, and see the starlit sky prostituted by those blood-red patches of flame, I turn away, sick at heart, and go to bed, and think that they, with all the sublimity of their sacrifice, are dupes. We are dupes, all the world dupes of the handfuls of charlatans who make wars, exploiting and trading upon those noble traits of human nature. Your country needs you, cry armament manufacturers, well knowing that at that cry millions of hearts that beat true and honest will begin to beat proudly and courageously, and millions of men will march out to slay their brothers. I thank God from the bottom of my heart for the inestimable privilege of being allowed to try and patch up the results of this ghastly mistake. But oh, the infinitesimal effect of the patching, the awful smallness of oneself amidst these vast forces. I was chatting to a lad in the wards this afternoon, both arms amputated, and he was trying to compose a letter to his fiancée about it.
In April, the front flared up again in the Second Battle of Ypres, with the shock of the first German use of gas. The FAU cars, now 40 strong, dashed together to the scene of the emergency, and for 9 days and nights the men had hardly an hour's sleep at a time. They had seen the barrage of gunfire, the dense clouds of gas rolling over the trenches and spreading across the countryside. And as they came to the front lines, they were caught up in a running crowd with hoarse voices shouting, "The Germans have broken through! Every man that can carry a rifle, come along!" Then came the casualties.
The poor, choking, gasping, dying and asphyxiated beggars who were already beginning to pour in. We could do nothing but transport them with the utmost speeds to safety and proper attention. All through the night, our buses beat it back and forth to the railhead. The wounded followed the asphyxiated. Blood covered the stretchers, dripped from bandages, lay in little pools about the drive and steps and flower beds. Still we worked and flung ourselves down now and then for a brief sleep. A breathless messenger comes for cars, and we go out with two to behold one of the most pitiable spectacles the war will disclose. A whole ward of the civil hospital wiped out. 11 corpses, mostly nuns, strew the floor, the dust of plaster whitening them, choking up the streams of blood. An old Trappist monk with wounded head totters about, helping everyone, being a hero amongst it all. Out again to the front, where men filling up from the reserves passed our gate, gay and singing, to be carried back to us, maimed, on stretchers within an hour. The roar of guns, before, behind, on both sides of us, was continuous and appalling. They started shelling the ambulance post itself. The garden was packed was pocked with holes. The room where we lived strewn with debris. The kitchen car riddled. We moved back a few hundred yards into some sheds. Still they shelled us.
Work at this extreme pressure continued for a month and was renewed at Whitsuntide for a time, when another attack was made on Eton. But by midsummer 1915, the work of the unit settled into a more established routine. Corder was made adjutant and was largely tied down to office work in Poberinga, though he had his own car and visited the various stations in villages behind the lines. He wrote in August that the days of roughing it were over. He bought himself a hairbrush and a pair of pyjamas. And he said, "Here at HQ, life is much less vivid than at the front, and nothing less than a sense of duty in accepting this promotion would have weighed with me. There is not the same dear intimacy with the wounded, stretcher bearers, doctors, nurses, which make a happy family of the staff in the danger zones. But with a sigh, one tries to think one is glad to be where one is most wanted, and there's an end to it." In October 1915, Corder wrote home,
"I feel more and more that we who have been spared are only justified in going on living if our future lives manifest at every point and at all times a heroism at least equal to that of the soldier who is killed in battle. One hates to have such a comparatively comfortable time as we are having now, whilst friends are in the trenches."
and in November,
"I am getting soul sick of the work out here the last 4 months, mending motor cars instead of men. It's also astonishingly different from last winter. I wonder how long it would take the world to settle down to war as the normal state of things. It would be like adjusting oneself to slide as comfortably as possible down a slope into hell."
Corder's inner conflict intensified with the introduction of conscription. He began to wonder whether he shouldn't return to ordinary work and take his stand with those who were resisting pressure for military service. But, the question became more insistent still after Corder attended a landmark yearly meeting of British Quakers in London in January 1916 while home on leave, which had been called in response to the passing of the Compulsory Service Act. The decision regarding the attitude of the society Friends should adopt was largely left to young men of military age. Among the 450 of these who were present, there was near complete unanimity in recommending that no form of service should be undertaken by Quakers that would help in prosecuting the war. Many were prepared to change their employment if required for constructive alternative civilian work, but a significant number, who came to be known as absolutists, regarded this as unduly compromising and would accept only unconditional exemption under the Act. The yearly meeting upheld the young men's decision, stating that our testimony as a society is against all war, and on behalf of the liberty and supremacy of conscience, express the intention to support all those who might suffer as conscientious objector, whether Quakers or not. Corder returned to his FA comrades in France, his unit, deeply inspired by this momentous gathering that he'd been part of in London. After the introduction of conscription, the unit was largely reinforced by conscientious objectors who'd accepted it as a means of alternative service. But there was a body of original FAU members who felt like Corder and urged to return home and share the witness and sufferings of those who wished to go right up to what they called the peace front. Corder was acutely aware of the responsibility he bore as an adjutant of the unit, and his loyalty also to his FAU comrades, some of whom expressed outright hostility towards those thinking of taking this unconditional action, and who tried to stigmatise them as rebels. But in May 1916, Corder explained to his family in a letter home that it has been dawning on me gradually that the continuance of our work does in fact depend on the sinking of our individuality and the stifling of our freedom of expression. The Conscription Act has meant a gradual tightening of the screw of military discipline. And I cannot help feeling we are in effect a conscript unit, with a more sympathetic control immediately above to be sure, but the iron hand lurking in the background. Corder decided that he had no alternative but to resign from the FAU. In a personal statement he read out at his second court-martial a year after this, Corder said,
"I was baffled more and more by the consciousness that, under military control, the primary objective of our work was the refitting of men to take their places again in the trenches. It seemed to me that for one called to serve in the cause of peace, the position was becoming untenable. At home, men who stood for the same ideals as myself were being reviled as cowards and shirkers and forced into the army against their principles. When some of them were sent to France and became liable for the death penalty, I hesitated no longer. It seemed to me more honest and more manly to take my stand with them, make public profession of my faith, and accept the consequences."
Corder could have had exemption by continuing his ambulance work had he felt it right to do so, and he was begged to do this. But he said, "I am enlisted in the highest service I know, the formation of a world fellowship of men prepared to die rather than take part in war. And the foundations of such a fellowship, which is already spreading from country to country, cannot rest upon compromise." Among the conscientious objectors that Corder refers to, who were sent to France, was a group of around 50 who became known as the Harwich Frenchmen. One of them, Howard Martin, later wrote, "I think that there was a very definite movement that they would break our resistance by sending us to France. If they could get us into the firing line, then they could pass the death sentence, and that was that." In May 1916, the COs were interned on the Essex coast in a Napoleonic-era fort, originally built to house French prisoners, a vile place, according to Alfred Evans, one of the latter-day Frenchmen, in which severe punishment was given out. For example, Corney Barrett and Rendell Wyatt were strapped up in straitjackets and stood against the wall in the hot sun of the May of that year, and the vindictiveness of the military prison staff saw to it that the straitjackets were strapped too tightly. I and Harry Stanton and Bernard Bonner were later put into the cells, completely dark, dripping with water, overrun with rats, for 3 days, without food. The spirit of the Frenchman, however, appears to have been undimmed, as Alfred Evans remembered. An officer told us we were to be taken in irons to France, where we'd be under active service conditions, and if we persisted in our line of conduct, we would be shot. We were asked to take our pay and make our wills in a space provided in the army playbook, and this, we all 17 of us, refused to do. The men were moved from Harwich in the middle of the night and taken via a circuitous route across London and down to a boat at Southampton, together with another group of 16 COs from the north of England who'd been imprisoned in Richmond Castle. None of the COs had been allowed to warn their friends and families. Howard Martin later described how someone managed to throw out a note from the train which landed on the platform, enabling news to spread of the CO's situation. By the time the low conscription fellowship became aware of what was happening, the Harwich group had already arrived at Cindercamp Le Havre. They were sent out on parade. Alfred Evans describes how,
on the vast parade ground, before a line of some 30 officers, were paraded about 1,000 men, and one of us was placed with each company of the battalion, and the parade was ordered to "Shut! Turn right! Quick march!" Not one of us moved. There was a lot of shouting, movement among the officers and the NCOs, as the mass of men nearly reached the edge of the parade ground, and small parties were sent back, and we were dragged off. But for a short time, it must have been an amazing sight to see this small group of us scattered motionless over that huge parade ground. I'm sure that none of us who were present at that event will ever forget that sight. We were held fast by the collecting parties and marched off to the army service stores. I went to an engineering shop and was told to feed an automatic saw. I didn't stand to attention before the officer giving the orders and had my ankles kicked together, but not hard. I didn't feed the saw, and for all I have known, the steel rods may still be on the turntable there. One of the Camerons came over to me and said, "I don't agree with you, laddie, but I admire your pluck," and gave me a cup of tea. There were stormy scenes when the officer came in and saw that I had done nothing, and once again I was kicked to a position of attention. This wasn't done so that it hurt, but to make a show of discipline before the rest of the men. At the end of the day, none of us had given in, and that night we were in the guard room awaiting events. About that time, a soldier sent up his dinner to me with his compliments. I was completely taken aback, sending my thanks and appreciation by one of the guards. I never saw him again, or found out who he was. I only hope he fared well and survived the war.
Howard Martin later recalled how the army used psychology in a bid to bring the conscientious objector into line. We were forever being threatened with the death sentence. Over and over again we'd be marched up and read out a notice, some man being sentenced to death through disobedience at the front. Whether they were true cases or not, I don't know. It was all done with the idea of intimidating us. The military authorities didn't know quite how to react. It was something quite outside their experience, and it became clear that we weren't people who could be bullied into it. Despite the bullying, not all soldiers they encountered were unsympathetic, and there were many incidents of small kindnesses, like this one remembered by Alfred Evans. At about 7:30, the sergeant of the guard, Irish Guards, looked in. He was a tall, gaunt man, wiry and tough, but a jovial soul. He asked us, "Have you boys got any money?" And we said, "We have a bit, not much." "Give it to me. There's nobody about. They've all gone into town tonight, those officers and men. I thought you boys might like a bit of the do. You've a tough time ahead of you." He was a grand lad and he did us proud. He either went himself or he sent down to the canteen. He brought back a load of stuff, which our own money could never have paid for. 3 or 4 men, including Harry Stanton, were moved to a field punishment unit at Harfleur to serve 28 days.
Soon we were called out for our punishment. Provision was made for this by means of a wooden framework consisting of uprights 4 or 5 yards apart, with connecting beams at about a height of 5 feet. We were placed with our backs to the posts and arms outstretched. Our ankles were then tied together, and our arms tied tightly at the wrists to the cross beams. We were to remain in this position for 2 hours. For those of us who were of average height, the strain upon our arms was just bearable, though our wrists quickly became numbed. But for those who were shorter, the punishment was painful in the extreme, since they were forced to stand entirely on their toes in order to relieve their arms of the dead weight of the body.
Alfred Evans's attitude to this ill treatment that was actually far worse than this on many occasions, was this. I did not feel that we had any special grounds for complaint. We were exceptional cases after all, and militarism was making an effort to break down our resistance. What did seem to me shameful, however, was that any voluntary soldier who was offering his life in what he believed to be his country's service was liable to a similar punishment for quite a trivial offence, or at the instance of a prejudiced officer. The group's stay at Harfleur was brought to a sudden end, and they were marched off under armed guard. One of the soldiers told Harry Stenton, "You're going to Boulogne, from there to the front line, so you can be shot if you still disobey orders." He seemed very indignant. "I would sooner shoot the officer who gave me that order," he said fiercely, "than shoot one of you fellows. I came out here to fight the Germans, not to murder Englishmen." British soldiers were issued with a regulation postcard sent home from the front, made up of a series of impersonal standard sentences. John Brocklesby, a member of the Richmond 16, managed to modify one of these postcards so that it read, "I'm being sent to Boulogne." Thus the men's whereabouts were confirmed. Questions were raised in Parliament by sympathetic MPs, and at the request of Lord Kitchener, who was anxious to ensure the COs were being treated fairly, wanting to know whether they were prepared to serve their country in any other way than military service, a delegation was sent over to France to bring back a report on the men. It may be imagined that we were immensely encouraged by this sign of the devotion and resource of our friends in England, one of the COs commented. The delegation's visit to France also meant that the military authorities were made aware of the impossibility of carrying out their plans to execute the COs without publicity. The parliamentary delegation's visit to Boulogne was undoubtedly one of the factors which, while not deterring the army from their grim determination to use the death penalty against COs, nevertheless succeeded in forcing some kind of compromise. In the second week of June 1916, the Harwich and Richmond COs, together with another group from Seaford, were all tried at Henryville Camp in Boulogne by Field General Court Martial, which had the ultimate punishment at its disposal. Alfred Evans was among those court-martialed on the 12th of June.
On the Monday, I was taken before the court-martial in Boulogne, which consisted of a colonel and 2 captains, and was a field general court-martial, which has life and death powers. At the invitation of the President, I made my own statement, saying that I was opposed to war on religious and political grounds. A day or 2 before the trial, a captain had come to see me and said, "I've just left the company office and I was looking over your papers. They're marked death and in red at the top. Do you still intend to go on with this?" And I said, "Yes. You see, sir, men are dying in agony in the trenches for the things they believe in, and I wouldn't be any less than them." To my utter astonishment, he stepped back a couple of paces, saluted, and then came forward, extending his hand, which I shook heartily. I never saw him before or since.
On Thursday, 15th of June, 4 men who were regarded as ringleaders were the first to be taken from the punishment barracks at Longville to be read out, that is, to hear their sentences. One of them later wrote,
We found an escort waiting for us in the courtyard below. We turned towards the outskirts of the town and climbed one of the hills. One of the hills overlooking it, which afforded a wide view of the channel. I cast many a glance in the direction of the white cliffs of Dover, for this might be our last opportunity. We turned into the midst of a huge military camp, and many curious eyes, evidently puzzled by our cheerful demeanour under such circumstances, followed us as we made our way to a large open space in the middle, 150 yards or more square, and evidently used as a parade ground. After a wait of perhaps 3/4 of an hour, the various groups of soldiers began to form themselves into 3 sides of a huge square, until several thousand were present. When an appropriate hush had been arranged, the adjutant, who was to read out the sentence, took charge. Private XX number YY of 2nd Eastern Company Non-Combatant Corps, tried by field court-martial for disobedience while undergoing field punishment. Sentenced to death by being shot. Here a pause. Confirmed by General Sir Douglas Haig. A long pause. And commuted to 10 years penal servitude. I was number 3 on the list, and as I stepped forward, I caught a glimpse of my paper as it was handed to the adjutant. Printed at the top in large red letters and doubly underlined was the word death. I can hardly analyse the feelings that flashed through my mind as I caught sight of that word. I had faced the possibility of death sentences before, and now I accepted the fact almost without concern, whilst my mind was occupied mechanically and dispassionately with considering the immediate practical effects. It would be a great trial for Mother. My sister would have to leave school. People in England would make a great fuss. The thought of why I should receive a different sentence to the others did not occur to me. I simply accepted it as a fact. And commuted to 10 years penal servitude. So, it was not to be death after all. But as I stood listening to the sentence of the rest of our party, the feeling of joy and triumph surged up in me, and I felt proud to have the privilege of being one of that small company of CEOs testifying to a truth which the world as yet had not grasped, but which it would one day treasure as a most precious inheritance.
Altogether, in June 1916, 34 men received the death sentence, commuted to 10 years penal servitude, and another 7 received lesser sentences. Back in England, questions were asked in Parliament concerning reports that CEOs were being sentenced to death in France. The Under-Secretary for War in Asquith's government initially dismissed such reports as unfounded rumours, only having to admit the true situation a few days later. Prime Minister Asquith himself, accused of misleading the House, promised a statement later in the week. On the 29th of June, Asquith was forced to pledge that it would never happen again. The incident did much to bring home to the public the fact that the many who called themselves conscientious objectors were genuine in their profession, willing as they evidently were to face death for conscience sake. The Manchester Guardian commented, "We hope that that people will now be satisfied that conscientious objector may at least be what he professes to be, and is not necessarily a mere coward masquerading under a fine pretense. The Daily News, shocked by the civil authorities' ignorance of the doings of its military arm, asked, "Where are we drifting?" At the end of June, the War Office succeeded in bringing the COs home again from Boulogne. After sentence, the ill treatment had ceased, and they had been allowed 2 or 3 visitors, including a Quaker chaplain. French soldiers hissed them as they embarked at Rouen, and a British crowd pelted them with eggs and tomatoes when they arrived at Southampton, where they were split up and sent to various civil jails and labour camps, including Dice, Quarry, near Aberdeen. The recurring military defiance of government pledges meant that every young man who went before a tribunal to testify to conscientious objection knew he might be called upon to die for his convictions. It enabled the tribunals to go on threatening COs with death in the face of government denials that such a thing was possible, right through to the final year of the war. To return to Corder Catchpool's experience as a conscientious objector, I should say the talk is really dedicated not only to my grandfather, but to all conscientious objectors, which is why I included this lengthy passage about the Harwich Frenchman and the Richmond 16. And it's an appropriate point maybe to pause and ask how you're doing. This is quite lengthy. Are we okay? Yeah. Good. I realise if I was planning this again, this would be the place where we'd all go out to get a drink of wine and some nibbles, and you can come back for the second half. But I think the second half's not as long as the first, so it's not a half actually. No, I'm rubbish at maths. So, Corder Catchpool. In May 1916, he severed his connection with the Friends Ambulance Unit. The certificate of exemption granted by the War Office for military service was withdrawn. Not wishing to waste his remaining days of freedom, Corder went to Woodbrook, a Quaker study centre in Birmingham, as leader of an international group formed with the help of the newly founded Fellowship of Reconciliation. The group consisted of young pacifists, many like Corder awaiting arrest, who wished to prepare themselves for future international work by reading up on social and political issues and deepening their insight into the way of Christ, as well as speaking at adult schools and meetings of many kinds. Corder felt that his entire life and work up to this point had been an apprenticeship in peacemaking. Now he called for an adventurous trust in God, a conviction that hearts are changed by love, that gentleness does achieve, through patience and suffering, the victories that force cannot win. We take issue, he said, with those who hold that love, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is not a possible basis for all human relationships today. Where they see a passive sentiment, we see an invincible force. Corder was arrested at Woodbrook on January the 11th, 1917, along with 7 other COs. And preparing for this talk, I happened to be at Woodbrook myself a couple of weeks ago for a prison chaplains conference in connection with work that I do in Durham. And it was quite strange to be sitting in the dining room having my lunch and thinking of the army arriving in 1917 and arresting a bunch of students of Woodbrook College in that manner. So he was arrested on the 11th of January 1917, brought before a police court, handed over to the military. While awaiting an escort, they cheerfully spent their first weekend in prison, after which they moved about in an apparently aimless manner. No one seemed to know what to do with the little gang of COs. Corder was drafted into an infantry regiment, the 6th Worcesters, and transferred to the guardroom of Worcester Barracks. The old machine works along, and COs drift through its mill without any serious friction, Corder noted in his diary. The soldiers are all sympathetic, the NCOs harsh, the officers frigid but courteous. The discomforts and privations of the guardroom were familiar enough to Corder after his time at the front in France. He felt very much at home among the soldiers.
Here we have a time full of interest. My only trouble is lack of sleep. I can't do it packed like herrings in a tub. The hard floor gives me little trouble as I'm used to that in the unit. The whole life reminds me constantly of early unit billets. It is not at all unlike, except no freedom here and only 1/2 hour in the open air since arrival. It might hurt one's feelings to be so suspect if we did not know that by the men themselves we are not in the least bit suspect. They are constantly apologising for the old machine which alone actuates their movements. We have had wonderful experience with our guards. They come in frigid and a trifle suspicious and leave after 24 hours the best of friends. The CO attitude seems perfectly natural to them. In their own way, many of them even understand it. Some don't even trouble to understand it, but take you at your face value of a good fellow and give you the same in return. Foul-mouthed, as practically everyone in the army is. They have as kind a heart at bottom as you could wish. Most of them have been out to the front and wounded once or twice. I have had great talks with those who know places where I have been. No one has any delusions left about the war, such as one meets everywhere from civilians at home. Every man of them wants the end and doesn't care a toss how it's arrived at. The corporal last night, bluff, unsentimental as a stone, blurted out a few words of very sincere regret that we had to go. Each evening we have asked, "Have you any objection to our having a little meeting?" "Do whatever you like," is the reply. And as we read a few verses, sing a hymn or two, and have a few words of prayer, the foul talk stops, absolute quiet reigns, and the soldiers' heads are bowed. We were told that men in the guardroom were putting in applications to take charge of us. They gave us a quiet, "Good luck wherever you go," when we left.
Several weeks followed under guard in a succession of barracks. At Reading, Corder noted in his diary, as we were getting up, a newspaper boy came in, so we shared a daily news while sitting around the fire waiting for brekker and reading the leading article. Ah me, newspapers in wartime. As I read that article of blood and iron, I was not dissatisfied to be a prisoner for my faith, though for it I have as yet suffered hardly any discomfort. Women rail a little sometimes as we go through the streets, and if there be any ordeal in our position, it's outside the army, not inside. There's not 1 in 1,000 has the courage to stand by his conscience, said a soldier to me yesterday. I have food for thought when I contrast this attitude of the men themselves with civilians I have met. Men and women who have thrown themselves into a passion of rage when I have handed them a picture of Christ on the cross with the words, "In Christ's name, peace." They have torn it up under my eyes. Corder was to return to his reflections upon civilian attitudes to the war on the home front in his prison journal, Letters of a Prisoner for Conscience' Sake. In one especially interesting passage in January 1918, Corder considers at some length the distinctive perspective of women. Commending his mother for helping with sewing for hospitals, he wrote, "It's a beautiful work, and if I were a mother and quick with my needle, I doubt not that I should be with you. I wish, however, that the members of every such sewing group had made it plain to their king and country that as women, as mothers, as Christians, they conceive their God-given mission in life to upraise and cherish manhood, not strike down and destroy. And thus it was not for them to have any part in making or waging war. Be sure that if mothers had done this, the war would be over by now. Diplomatists will have to find a way out at last. They could have found it 3 years ago. Women of Europe, why have you left a handful of young men to make your protest for you? Women in khaki, who revile us as we pass from office to office at the recruiting depot. God forgive you that you so misunderstand not us, but your womanhood. All honour to the women of peace, and above all to those who, in the bitterness of their own sorrow, have kept a sweet spirit and held the faith. At this point, Corder goes on to name and honour directly a number of heroic women who continue to witness courageously for peace after suffering the loss of dearly beloved husbands and brothers. This prompts him to comment that
there is such a fearful lack of imagination. Women who would turn pale or faint if a labourer fell from a ladder in the street and was carried by, white and still on a shutter, to the nearest hospital. These women open the newspaper over their tea and toast at breakfast and read with something like exultation of a victory in which thousands of boys have been slaughtered. That is what I mean by lack of imagination. The French and Belgian nurses, whom I knew at Popperinga, would talk of "c'est ça le cochon de bush," the German pigs, and cry for vengeance in kind for all that has been done. Yet, when a blue-eyed young Saxon comes in terribly wounded, they pet and spoil him till the French poilus begin to show until they begin to show resentment, and they must desist. This is lack of imagination. I have seen men with faces shot completely away, the brain, and so life, spared by some cruel miracle. Nothing but a bloody mess, where the pleasant features of somebody's loved one used to be, and later, after the surgeon's attention, I have seen a flat white disc with holes in it, like a ghastly snowman. You do not think of these things, women, when you read of victories over the toast and coffee.
On January the 22nd, 1917, Corder and his friends faced their first court-martial, charged with disobeying a legal order to put on uniform. A few days later, the sentences were read out before the paraded troops, 112 days, hard labour each. Within an hour or two, the little band of COs and their escort were aboard a train en route for the final stage of their journey from Gaul to Wormwood and another wood. From Gaul to Wormwood, as Corder later described it. At Paddington, they were met by a group of relatives and friends, and the whole company had a restaurant supper together. Shortly after this, Corder passed through the forbidden gates of Wormwood Scrubs. I shall long remember the genuine hand grip, the few kind words of cheer, supplemented in one case by a whisper, the very last words I heard before going in. There's hardly a man in barracks but honours you in his heart. A Quaker prison chaplain had told Corder that he only knew of one case in which a man had emerged from a hard labour sentence, spiritually strengthened by the experience. And it was commonly said that 2 years of such confinement was the utmost that a man could stand without some permanent injury to soul and body. Corder served 2 years and a quarter in all. Before beginning his first term, he had written, "I dread prison and its consequences for myself, and for my mother far more." He found that the regime differed from prison to prison. Wormwood Scrubs was bad enough, Ipswich even worse, but between these came 6 months in Exeter prison, which were almost pleasant by comparison, and gay. The discomforts of hard beds and physical austerity were nothing new to Corder, but the challenge of loneliness and silence were far harder to meet. In the Scrubs, he soon experienced listlessness, lack of energy, and sleeplessness.
In prison, one does not get an excess of food. I often feel I can confront and deal with a week's dinners at a sitting without any inconvenience. and I know how one soon experiences loss of vigour, both mentally and bodily. At Norton Barracks, I ran several miles at a stretch, and when I got to the Scrubs, I was inclined to look down on the large number of men who fell out on the command to double exercise. A fortnight later, I was one of them. I could no more run above a couple of rounds than I could fly. Gradually, one establishes a sort of equilibrium on a lower level.
After 3.5 months hard labour in Wormwood Scrubs, Corder was taken under escort to Devonport, where he was straight away put before a second district court-martial on May 12, 1917, and sentenced to a further 2 years hard labour, commuted to 1 year in recognition of his services to ambulance work. This was subsequently reduced again to 6 months, which Corder served in Exeter Prison. Upon his release in October 1917, Corder was taken to Harwich, where a third court-martial sentenced him to another 6 months hard labour, this time in Ipswich Prison. Released just before Easter 1918, when the Battle of Somme was at its height, Corder was returned to Harwich, where he was court-martialed for a fourth time. Mindful of the extreme pressure the military authorities were under at this critical point in the war, he felt it right to trouble the cause as little as possible and made only a brief statement in his defence, in which he expressed his longing to be at the front, giving what service he might to the relief of suffering, were it possible to do so without compromise to the Military Service Act. The impulse to return to the work of healing, he said, was at times almost irresistible, but may God keep me steady and keep me faithful to a call I have heard above the roar of the guns. Corder had recently been awarded the Mons ribbon in recognition of his services there with the FAU. He chose not to wear this at his hearing in case it might lead to an acquittal by reason of my military service. But at the reading out of his sentence, to the astonishment of the officers present, Corder was wearing the ribbon. This time, the president of the court-martial was a notoriously harsh major who sentenced Corder to 2 years, 6 months, 2 years, 6 months of which were later remitted by the reviewing general. So Corder spent the last 18 months of his imprisonment fighting the psychological dangers of silence, monotony and brooding in the demoralising surroundings of Ipswich Prison. The jail was located in the midst of town buildings in smoky air. We've seen. From the windows, no hills were to be seen, as in Devon, nothing green, but a sea of roofs and factory chimneys and Paul's huge mill. Even while in Exeter, Corder had written, "The cruelty of absolute silence tells on me a good deal. I think 8 months of prison life and supersaturation of one's own thoughts tends to put one on a hair trigger emotionally. To deprive the human mind of expression, both in speech and writing, is like stowing precious stuff away in the damp. There is danger of mould and decay." After another 6 months of hard labour and solitary confinement in Ipswich, Corder wrote,
"During a continuous spell of 60 hours' rain, the perpetual twilight in the cell, the incessant trickling day and night of a water pipe just outside the window, all got on my nerves. The greatest danger to a prisoner is that of noticing things, especially the locking of prison doors. If one begins to notice that, and not be able to help noticing it, one is on the brink of a declivity marked dangerous."
Against the cold, Corder recommended brisk walking at exercise.
"I fold my arms behind me, both to keep my hands warm and my back straight and soldier-like. I feel a whimsical sort of attachment to, almost an affection for the old battalion, which, all things considered, has treated me so decently. I fancy I should have made a good soldier, but for this tiresome conscience of mine. By the way, if the army had to sit for 12.5 hours a day on a little stool, it might tend to get a little round-shouldered too, and I'm sure it would get a very sore behind."
two particular physical troubles to contend with. One was continual toothache. He could obtain neither prompt nor proper treatment, and he lost a number of teeth both while in prison and soon after he came out. The other handicap was sleeplessness, which came on in bouts, often lasting for weeks at a time. In later life, Corder suffered severely from insomnia. To add to the burden of wakeful nights, he developed a contrary weakness in the daytime and drowsiness and listlessness, falling asleep even during meal times. This was probably due to Corder's attempt to use every spare moment for study, when after a year he was allowed to have books sent in. Corder was determined from the outset to try to use his time in prison to prepare himself for future service. When the chance came with the entry of books, he settled down to serious work. He noted with interest that when his weary brain could not entertain any other reading, he was still able to read German, because of the direct connection with his desires for the future. Even at this time, in something between a dream and a fixed resolve, Corder was considering the possibilities for service in Berlin after the war was over. Some words spoken to him in Flanders when he tried to explain his pacifism to his French friends constantly reverberated in his mind. Allez en Allemagne, comme à porte, go and convert the Germans. France was Corder's first love, but Germany, now allowed to reap the suffering of the harvest of war, called him even more strongly, especially when he saw his own country about to take part in imposing a punitive peace. War news trickled slowly and scantily into prison, even the news of November the 11th, 1918. This, actually, is how Corder described hearing the cessation of hostilities, the end of the war. You can read it yourself. Corder's handwriting.
What he says is, I was sitting alone, stitching as ever, on special bright red mailbags. A hooter broke the silence. A tramp steamer at the dock gate, I said to myself mechanically. But hark, what is this? All the sirens in the town were booming. The war is over. The prison bell tinkled timorously, evidently fearing punishment for its temerity. Then it rang out, greatly daring, loud and long. Heavens, the risk it ran! Breaking all discipline like that. Or was it merely dinner? But it was only 11 a.m. by my sewing. I can guess within 5 minutes. Or fire, that must be it. But the siren's still hooting. Suddenly, I went a little mad too, and did unheard of things. I rang my emergency bell. A warder unlocked the door. The war was over. It was 11:05 a.m. Click, click went the lock again. I stood confused and started to sing the Te Deum, but stopped halfway. I was overwhelmed, oppressed with a sense of the awful responsibility of being spared, of going on living, a sense of not knowing how to try harder to do more than in the past. I could simply ask over and over again to be helped, to give my whole life to service, however lowly.
And the hymn book that Corder used to use in his cell is this one. So he received the news of the end of the war and sang the Te Deum in his cell. Although the war was over, Corder had to remain a further 5 months in prison. He writes movingly in letters home of the mounting restlessness and frustration caused by his continuing incarceration, with no mention of a release date.
I have no doubt that the government is embarrassed with serious difficulties in connection with our release. And if they think it impossible to release us altogether, then the only fair and decent basis upon which to proceed is length of service served. But I do not think we can suggest it. After making for 3 years a dignified protest against what we believe to be an unjust imprisonment, we must not go hand cap in hand, begging for release at any price. I set my hopes on the signing of peace, though eager for better things and prepared for worse. The chaplain assures me that all first offenders will be released then, and it would surely be too gross a scandal to exclude us from that category. Or perhaps nothing is too big a scandal to be tolerated just now. One receives blow upon blow, and still breathless from the last, is hardly able even to gasp anymore. I refer to the probable peace terms of which I have just heard forecast. I hope the report may be false, that some shreds of truth and honour may cling to the allies who offered to the enemy and published to the world their 14 points. In any case, a blow of crushing weight is about to fall on the German people.
Corder's final letter from prison is dated March 28, 1919. In it, he reviews somewhat pessimistically the prospects for peace in post-war Europe and Britain's future role in the world. He writes, "I'm gravely concerned at rumours of a new Military Service Act. I fear it is the thin end of the wedge and foreshadows a sinister attempt to introduce gradually permanent conscription on the continental system. It's only for a period, we're told, only to absorb the surplus unemployed. But next, we shall find that the unemployed must have military training when young to be of any use when they are called up. Then, as no one knows who the unemployed are going to be, the training must be general, and there we are. Our boys have to march, our scruples having meantime got their quietus through these slow narcotic stages. Anyway, some of us have scruples that won't lie down and die. The struggle we hoped was just now ending, we are prepared to regard as just only beginning, if need be, even to the contemplation of a whole life in and out of prison for those who have made protest that can never stop now. I feel more convinced than ever since coming to prison that the most effective weapon for the war against war is an international fellowship on a spiritual basis of men in every land who are prepared to face the utmost penalty rather than fail in loyalty to the cause of peace."
I'm afraid I've said this before, but it is too much in my mind. The cause of peace has suffered from old men, good old men, bless them, sitting around, talking around tables. Good men, but old. Congresses, conferences, even leagues of nations may help. But the past has revealed their utter inadequacy in the hour of trial. Enough of peace on paper. It shrivels up and fades away as smoke in the fiery furnace. Only one thing can face that, as of old. Lives, young lives, with daring faith to stand steadily against war at all cost. Not peace at any price, but peace at terrific cost, if need be. Such a fellowship could only have been started at a time of war. It's something quite new, therefore full of hope. And governments know it's dangerous, therefore they're harsh. And therefore, I forgive them.
On April the 19th, 1919, after 2 years, 86 days, Corder walked out of Ipswich prison a free man. For the rest of his life, till his death at the age of 69 in a climbing accident on Monte Rosa in the Swiss Alps, Corder continued to dedicate himself to the cause of peace. Corder's study of the German language and culture during his time in solitary confinement behind bars bore fruit in the immediate post-war period in the relief and reconstruction work he embarked upon in Germany, during which Corder also met his future wife and life partner, Gwen Southall. There's an interesting story about that. He was so wrecked when he got out of prison and so determined to go to Germany that he was pretty much a liability when he got there. His health broke down and he had to be sent away from Berlin into the countryside to recuperate under the care of a nurse who turned out to be his future wife. They had a lot of time together with nothing to do in the German countryside. So, from 1930 to 1936, as Hitler and his Nazis became ever more powerful, Corder and Gwen were helping to establish just the kind of international Quaker embassy that Corder had envisaged while sitting behind bars as a prisoner of conscience, the Friends International Centre in Berlin. My mum, our mum, Jean Corder Catchpool, Corder's eldest daughter, was a schoolgirl in Berlin during the Hitler period and was actually in the Olympic Stadium in 1936 on the very day that Hitler refused to award Jesse Owens his 100-metre gold medal because he was disappointing from an ethnic point of view. The reason I include this picture is also partly because Jordan's, of course, is where Corder trained in the FAU at the start of the First World War, and it's where our mum and dad were married, and it's where their ashes are interred presently. So, I think there may be one more to move on to. Yes, this is a picture of Corder and Gwen, an intriguing photograph because there are two grandchildren present, and this is Rob, who was the only one of our family who overlapped with Corder in his lifetime by a couple of years, and Annette, who you heard from at the beginning, who's sitting in the middle next to Gwen, with Joanna, our cousin, her eldest. Annette can date this picture very precisely because of the age that Joanna is. So this was actually taken a matter of weeks only before Corder set off for the Monte Rosa with Gwen. So, a personal postscript now. Preparing this talk about my grandfather over the past year or so has turned out to be life-changing for me. we grew up with the Corder Catchpool stuff. And I spent a lot of my early life trying to live it down, but to disown any association with Corder Catchpool whatsoever. You might find that baffling, but when you're a teenager, when you're a kid, you want to be introduced as yourself, not as someone else is something else. And it's really been this part of my life that, having engaged deeply with Corder through reading about him and reflecting and preparing this, that I feel like I've got to know him in a completely new and first-time way. It's an impact. The impact of this is best summed up by some words from Muriel Lester, the co-founder of Kingsley Hall, a workers' educational foundation in the East End of London. And I'm grateful to Caroline for this quotation. Twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize herself, Muriel Lester was the secretary of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and she was a friend of Gandhi, who stayed at Kingsley Hall when he visited Britain in 1931. And Muriel Lester says this: once your eyes get open to pacifism, you can't shut them again. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You may bitterly regret the fact that you happen to be one of the tiny minority of the human race who have caught this angle of vision. You can't help it. At his third district court-martial in 1917, Corder Catchpool stated that,
I believe that England will be honoured in history for having had the courage to introduce exemptions on conscientious grounds. Had she not done so, some thousands of us would have been shot, a fate which overtook many under the less liberal regimes of Germany, Austria and Russia. But I believe the order to shoot would have been repugnant to the British Army and to large sections of our people.
In the end, no conscientious objectors were executed for refusing to fight in the First World War. However, a total of 306 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed after court-martials for cowardice or desertion. Many of these men would today have been recognised as suffering from post-traumatic stress. It was not until 2007 that these men finally received a posthumous pardon. The Shot at Dawn monument at the National Memorial Arboretum at Ullerwas in Staffordshire is modelled on the likeness of Private Herbert Burden, who features in the exhibition next door, of the 1st Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers. Herbert lied about his age to enlist in the armed forces and was executed at the age of 17 for desertion. 73 conscientious objectors died in World War I as a direct consequence of their resistance to militarism. 10 in prison, 24 in Home Office remand centres, 6 in military custody, and the rest shortly after release. Plans were mooted as early as the 1920s for a special war memorial to these 73 men. The project came to nothing, though the German peace movement later raised a bronze plaque to them, believed to have been destroyed after the Nazis came to power. Today, they have a lasting memorial in Tavistock Square in London, and May the 15th each year is International Conscientious Objectors Day. And Annette at the beginning was talking about having got back from London on May the 15th. Last year she had been to attend the annual ceremony at the monument in Tavistock Square on International Conscientious Objectors Day. Next one. I'm deeply indebted to Corder Catchpool and to Gwen for all that I've learned from them while I've been studying Corder's life and writings, and to my late parents as well for their inspiration and personal example, as well as to the wider Catchpool family, particularly Annette Wallace, Corder's youngest and only surviving daughter, whom you heard from at the start of this talk. And thanks to Rob as well, the only member of our family to have walked on the earth with Corder in their lifetimes, for Rob's assistance in this. And finally, special thanks and gratitude to Sarah, who, my other half, who has had to put up with quite a lot during the countless hours that I've been AWOL in the previous century while I was preparing this talk. Thank you. Last slide. Thank you very much.
But that talk and the example of Corder Catchpool certainly for me redefines courage, redefines what I understand by conscience. Really thank them again.
I gave this talk 2 or 3 weeks ago in Sheffield as the part of the Off the Shelf Festival, and the rather curmudgeonly stand-in for Rob on that occasion had decided in advance that there wouldn't be any applause, which left the ending in some disarray. But I had already decided that any expression of appreciation of that nature would be received on behalf of the conscientious objectors that we've been talking about this evening. And also, actually, on behalf of the suffragettes as well, I went to see the film recently, and I heard Owen Jones, who some of you may read in The Guardian, as part of the Off-the-Shelf Festival, reminding us that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and that the human rights, freedoms and privileges we enjoy have not been handed down like sweets by the governments of previous generations. They've been fought for and sacrificed for by countless courageous people with many different motivations for their witness. And so the applause that you've just generously offered us is really for them. Voices and Choices, the exhibition that we've put together, is really the clues in the name. And this is just something I picked up when I was in Sheffield for the other talk. It was pinned to my sister Cass' pinboard in her kitchen. It's a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, and it seems to encapsulate what Voices and Choices is about, and what hopefully this talk this evening has been about. In the long run, we shape our lives and we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die. And the choices we make are ultimately our own responsibility. Thank you very much.